speaker is Ismo, and you went full screen. And
okay, thank you.
So he's a professor of physics and didactic physics and physics teacher education, all these things, nice, at the Department of Physics in University of Helsinki. And his title is a network analysis of term science and scientific knowledge as they're used by different authors in science education research. Two different accounts indicate communication across different views. You can start this, sorry, I'm reminding you, you have 20 to 25 minutes for the talk and then the rest 5 or 10 for questions.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Evelyn. So my background is in physics. I'm physics professor in Department of Physics, but my duties for several years have been teacher education, physics teacher education, and research related to physics teacher education. So my talk will derive from this area of interests, and what we have done recently in our research group is an attempt to find out how students conceptualize physics theory, physics concepts, and the knowledge structures in physics by paying attention on the way they talk about physics. It is very much inspired by the idea that actually what a teacher can't express verbally, it is not a good basis for teaching if there is a lot of information which is not somehow given to students by speaking, by writing, and by showing the written documents. So language has a very central role in communicating the science and language of science. You can somehow perhaps see a kind of Wittgensteinian approach in this, that what you can't speak about, you can't actually think about, or at least your thinking is somehow incapable to touch the core issues. So this talk is not so much about the student learning. Instead, it's about how the community of didactics and didactics researchers in science education communicate their ideas about the nature of science. It's a topic which has been discussed quite a lot in research literature, at least 30 years. And there are very fundamental issues and different views about what actually is science and scientific knowledge. One reason to select this topic is that more or less we already know what kind of different ideas there are. And in order to test some recent ideas, how we can explore the linguistic structures, this is a kind of ideal topic to discuss, to test what kind of analysis we can do and what we can find out by such analysis. So
Ismo, sorry, I guess you have a silent microphone.
Now you can hear me again, I guess. So the starting point is the nature of science in education, how different authors have discussed this topic in their writings. And science and scientific knowledge, they are terms and words which probably mean different things to different kind of schools and different authors. So much of the discrepancy, much of the discrepancy probably derives from the different way to understand these terms or key terms, key words, what they are using. And the most influential view of nature of knowledge and nature of science is Lederman's and Lederman's group. They have developed their ideas from the late 80s, and many groups in United States and Europe are actually now making use of these ideas. They build their understanding around the 7 tenets of the nature of science and how they see science and scientific knowledge. And the starting point of many authors is to go with these tenets or provide some criticism and criticize these tenets. There is a lot of literature about these different views and how perhaps a consensus can be reached, or some authors say that there is no consensus in this field of nature of science. The views are so different. There are a couple of recent reviews I have added in the notes which discuss these things, so I'm not going to discuss more about these differences and differing views and why they are differing. So the 7 tenets the Lederman group introduced is first the empirical nature of science, the character of scientific theories and laws, the creative and imaginative nature of scientific knowledge, and the theory-laden nature of scientific knowledge. Then there is the social and cultural embeddedness of scientific knowledge, and the 6th is the myth of the single scientific method. One of the reasons to introduce these 7 tenets was to counterfight the idea, which is very common in textbooks, that there exists a certain scientific method you can learn and you can apply in all different fields of science, which guarantees that we will get an objective and reliable knowledge. And then the 7th is the tentative nature of scientific knowledge. These 7 tenets, as Lederman and his group introduced and collaborators introduced these terms, they found this support from the philosophy of science, history of science, and social studies of science. And it's a kind of agglomeration of the basic core ideas, which many of the philosophers and science and technology studies researchers seem to agree on. And of course, there are different views and different things, but many approve this kind of categorization of the terms. So why these lexicons are of interest? One reason is that, or the collection of the terms, verbs, which we call lexicons, many authors seem to use the same terms, but when you read carefully what they are saying, you can't avoid the impression that they are somehow speaking across each other, and they are not actually speaking about the same topics at all. This is a kind of classic example of the situation where the different paradigms have so different way of using the vocabulary and terminology that it's very difficult to see how to find the consensus. And even worse, often people are not aware that they are speaking about, or they are using same terms, but they are speaking a somewhat different kind of things. So reason to pay attention to these lexical networks is to reveal differences, and our attempt is to find a simple enough way to do this kind of research so that we avoid a very heavy machinery and very complicated analysis in order to be able to apply this kind of analysis to student reports and what students are saying, especially the teacher students. And now in this study, we have taken 2 texts which are from Lederman, or it's an agglomeration of texts from 2 sources which very much overlap, and it's easy to combine the parts which discuss these 7 tenets. And then the other source is by Igal Galili, who has given very heavy criticism about the Lederman's ideas, criticizing each of the 7 tenets in a turn and provided a different kind of view and approach on nature of science. So in a sense, these 2 texts, they are in opposite directions in their conceptions of the nature of science and scientific knowledge. What we have done is that we have constructed a stratified lexical network, first finding out the nouns in the texts, then the verbs in the sentence level, then the clauses in the sentences, and then combined these clauses as a complete sentences, then finding co-texts or sentences which speak about the same topic, and finally the contexts. The contexts are actually very easy because the contexts are nearly directly the 7 tenets. And then we build a directed network in order to construct a lexical network. This is done semi-automatically by using the tools provided by mathematical software, which is very, very easy to use, but still performs quite a reasonable job in doing this kind of grammatical and syntactical analysis. Then when we have constructed the network, we begin to look how these different nouns are actually connected. Are they connected in the level of clauses? Are they connected in the level of sentences, co-text, or contexts? So it's a stratified network. And we simply start looking how the different nodes become activated or how they can be reached from different nodes. And for this, of course, the well-known graph Laplacian is very good tool. And we construct a macroscopic state of the network by using this graph Laplacian. This is the idea introduced by Domenico and Biamonte in their paper some years ago. And this seems to do very good and nice job in finding out the concepts which are shared and the concepts which are very difficult to reach from this stratified network. Then we build up a simplified, because you can understand that we have about, in these cases, about 600, 700 key words, key terms, which might be of interest. It's too much to keep track and we need to simplify things. So then what is next done is to construct a lexical profile which agglomerates expressions which are very close to each other, not synonymous, but they belong to same taxonomic classes. And we have decided to have 13 taxonomic classes. Here you can see the taxonomic classes on the left side: scientific knowledge, nature of science, science in general, theoretical knowledge, observation, scientific inquiry, inference and explanation, theory ladenness, subjective aspects, social and cultural embeddedness, rationality, scientific method, and nature and reality. Why these 13 classes? Simply, when we do a community analysis of the lexical networks, we will find nearly always these 13 classes somehow represented in these networks. And on the right side, you see the first case, the Lederman's case, how different words are falling or are breaking on these different thematic communities. You can see the abbreviations on the left side. You can see that we have a very well represented nature of science, scientific knowledge, and so on. In the upper row is represented the terms and words which are connected in the low level, in the syntactic level of clauses and sentences, and where you have a large circle, it means that it is very well connected in the network. It has a high communicability or high value of this communicability in the network. In the lower row, the analysis is repeated by using a different parameter which weights more heavily the long distance connections, the connections on the level of co-texts and contexts. And you can see that certain changes will happen. Certain circles, certain items, or certain terms, they diminish and certain terms grow. For example, here in global connectivity, research is very importantly and connected well, while in the local level, it's not connected so well. And also some terms retain their importance, like nature of science, which is now hidden here behind the scientific law. In the close level, in the shallow syntactic level, scientific law doesn't play a strong role. But when you increase the syntactic depth, you see that scientific law begins to gain importance. This simply means that such terms which gain importance in the deeper level of the syntactic connections, in the level of context and cotexts, they are discussed repeatedly in different sentences, different clauses. The meaning of these words and terms become enriched as you advance reading the text. So in a sense, this kind of network, which is very well connected, and you can find a very clear community structure and certain key concepts which corresponds well to the 7 tenets, you might perhaps say that it's a kind of coherent lexical network. Terms are discussed in coherent way, well-connected way, and it provides a kind of scaffolding to discuss in depth these terms. So this is the example of the Lederman's texts. Then next, we have a same kind of analysis of Galili's critical text. Galili has nearly 2 times more keywords in comparison to Lederman. Lederman had 600-700, but Galili has 1,200, 1,400. So in a sense, he brings in many new viewpoints, many new terms, many new ideas in criticizing the ideas of the Lederman. But as you can see, the networks are very fragile. You can't see a same kind of robust concepts where you have a very, very robust communities around the concepts. And the changes when you move from the shallow level of the syntaxes to more in-depth level of the context and contexts brings more changes in comparison to Lederman text. So in a sense, this can be interpreted in the way that how Galili is discussing the same 7 tenets Lederman discussed. He isn't providing so well-connected pieces of text which can be taken as an argument. It's a more like a piecemeal criticism where he brings in several viewpoints, but somehow the global structure doesn't come out. And you can understand that in this kind of situation, you probably get a much better and much more comprehensive idea of the nature of science and nature of scientific knowledge by reading text by Lederman, instead by reading Galili's text, where you give many ideas, but which are not really very well connected. So my own personal interpretation is that while Lederman and his group definitely developed their ideas and views to be applied for school level teaching and teacher education, they were very careful to pay attention how to provide a coherent structure. And of course, many things are left out. Galili has found those many things which are left out, but he doesn't manage to provide a very coherent picture, which is then very difficult to make any use in real teaching. And for teachers, it's very difficult to understand what actually should be done with all this wealth of information. Both authors are very competent, of course, and they are very well-known figures in the field of science education. So it's not a question about incompetence or ignorance or any such things. It's more or less question about paying attention what purpose you are writing for and what is the goal of your writing. And in this sense, this outlook of the lexical networks already reveals that probably Lederman's manages better to provide a coherent picture. Now, when we take a little bit different look on these issues, we can also make a very detailed listing of the key terms in these networks. There are too much of these key terms now to be discussed in detail, but you can see that many of these terms are quite well represented. The interesting thing is that the lexicon for the science is somewhat different from the lexicon for scientific knowledge. The weights are different, and for example, in scientific knowledge, you miss all these terms which are bolded here. So scientific knowledge in Lederman's network doesn't refer to human, social embeddedness, imagination, natural phenomena, and so on, but the science does. So different lexicons are attached to these two terms. And now when we classify these terms to these 13 dimensions, we will see this radar map, which you can see on the right side. It gives a very average picture how different dimensions are represented in Lederman's work. You can see that in Lederman, subjectivity of the knowledge or the subjective aspects of knowledge creation are very well represented. Scientific inquiry is represented quite well. And then the other dimensions are not so strong in comparison to these dimensions. Instead, in Galili's text, the methodology and the theory ladenness, rationality and the theory are the most important connections. And if you look for the deep structure or the deep contextual structure, theory and rationality, they overcome all other dimensions. So Galili is very keen to discuss rationality and theory, and that's actually where his criticism lies. He criticized Lederman that Lederman is not paying enough attention to methodology, rationality, and theoretical structure of scientific knowledge. He might be right in his criticism, but you can understand that in teacher education and in teaching about nature of science in general education, we must have more balance between these different dimensions. It's not only about rationality, theory, and methodology. And here, once more, these different lexicons compared. Now you can see that in this level, the lexicons are very different. And it really raises a question that can these different authors communicate or are they speaking about the same topic? Or do their views really differ in fundamental way? At least now it seems that there should be, and there probably is, some kind of gap in communication, although both of them are structuring their discussion about this, around these 7 tenets. So in this sense, the lexical analysis we have done, it really manages to reveal differences you can intuitively and qualitatively feel when you read these different texts. And in this sense, this analysis is a kind of proof of concept that this stratified lexical analysis is really capable of making visible these kind of differences. So the conclusions are that we need to pay attention on the lexicons. We have methods to analyze these lexicons, and the purpose to analyze such lexicons is to find out if different speakers and different authors have a different conception of the basic terms, because you can understand that it's very important when we begin to discuss some ideas and views. We first understand that we can use the same expressions a little bit differently, sometimes quite much differently. And the task we need to do is to overcome these communication barriers, to understand the polysemy of the key terms. And this analysis, I believe, provides somehow a starting point to find out where we can find the common core of the ideas, to build on this common core and to find ways to improve the common understanding and communication of these complicated ideas of science and scientific knowledge, so that we pay more attention on these differences, but also on similarities, how these vocabularies are used. So far, we have advanced, and we are continuing this study with a little bit newer ideas, and perhaps in coming years, you will hear more about the results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismo. Okay, so people that have questions are welcome either to write on chat or use the reaction button. I can ask a question until we have some. Right, I didn't see any question yet on the chat, but please feel free to ask everybody. So Ismo, thank you so much. So while I was listening to you, this question came up. Since also we have teachers here, and since, okay, I mean, your work is so interesting, and I can see how it will be useful, but I was wondering, until we reach at this point where we can analyze all the different school of thoughts and we know the consensus or the differences, what would be your suggestion to either teacher educators or specifically to teachers on how, if they come across these terms, how to use them, how to choose between the different school of thoughts?
That's a very good question. The way we have tried to approach this problem and how we have introduced it to our teacher students is that we need to pay attention where we agree. And it's not fruitful to start with positions where we disagree, because then the convergence of ideas and discussions is very difficult to find. And even a small amount of ideas and views we agree can act as a very fruitful starting point to find the consensus. And when we have found the consensus of the core issues, it's time to discuss the differences. But very often the authors in science education and even teachers, I think, they make the error that they start with the difference. They tell where they have different opinions and where they disagree. Instead, it would be much more fruitful to find the common points. And especially in practical teaching, when you discuss with the students, of course, it's quite natural to try to find out where we agree with the student and start a constructive dialogue with the student, instead of telling the student where he or she missed something or where he or she made some errors in argumentation and so on.
Okay, thank you so much.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ismo, for the great talk. So my question is about that radar plot that you are using. I was wondering, should we consider the perfect circular profile to be the ideal communication way, or is there any more fundamental particular pattern that we should aim at instead of just going to complete circular?
Yes, that's what we have also been thinking about. If you just fill the octagon or the polygon, everything is equally represented, then you might be tempted to think that this is the optimal situation, but it's probably too messy. So what is the use of the advantage of the radar maps? You can see which aspects are weighted more than the other aspects. And perhaps the most appropriate situation is that you have a certain amount of important dimensions, but none of the dimensions is really missing and none of the dimensions is dominating. In this radar map of Galilee, you saw that 3 aspects are dominating the map, and it's very difficult to agree that these 3 dimensions are really so important when you discuss science and scientific knowledge. There are other dimensions too.
Thank you very much.
Any other question? We have like a minute. Okay, so if you think of something, you can, I mean, we will be all in touch, as I